Have you ever questioned the accuracy of what we've been taught in the history books? Or have you blindly believed whatever version of history that was forced upon you? Slavery is the darkest chapter in human history, yet certain groups don't want to discuss it or even acknowledge it. Why? What might happen if more people looked into the truth? Let's find out. Slavery started precisely 404 years ago in British colonial America. The first recorded abducted Africans arrived in Virginia on August 25, 1619. This marked the beginning of the darkest period in all of human history. From 1619 to 1865, lasting 246 years until the 13th Amendment, and even beyond, enslaved black people endured a living hell. Correction, worse than hell, because there are no innocent people in hell, and every black person who served as a slave was innocent. Join us as we delve into the horrors of slavery that have been kept hidden from us for a long time. Slavery was much worse than what you thought, and it is disturbing. The innocent black individuals faced a fate even more horrifying than hell itself. They endured kidnappings, auctions, heart-wrenching family separations, relentlessly forced labor, cruel chainings, brutal shackling, painful whippings, horrific torture, amputations, sexual assaults, castrations, and lynchings. But the suffering didn't stop there. They also suffered a permanent loss of their land, language, culture, religion, and their identity. This racist terror, beyond imagination, persisted for an astonishing 2.5 centuries. The wounds that slavery inflicted cannot be healed. There is no way to compensate for the way these black people were treated. However, acknowledging what they went through and understanding their pain can, to some extent, bring them a sense of justice. While some argue that slavery officially ended in 1865, the truth is that it persisted in different forms for much longer. After 1865, it took on various shapes, such as sharecropping, black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, voter disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, redlining, police brutality, and mass incarceration, extending beyond the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All of these issues directly trace their roots back to slavery. Slavery played a crucial role in the economic prosperity of the South. The large plantations depended on slaves for their labor, without which they couldn't cultivate their fields effectively. The profitability of plantations was largely attributed to the availability of free labor, as hiring paid workers would have been much costlier. Moreover, owning slaves allowed planters to use them as collateral for borrowing money, a practice not feasible with individuals who weren't considered property. When the international slave trade ended, the value of existing slaves increased, prompting planters to engage in the breeding of slaves. This became a profitable endeavor as there was a demand to sell slaves to the Deep South and Midwest. Breeding slaves served multiple purposes, including ensuring a continuous source of labor. If purchasing new slaves became difficult, relying on the reproduction of the already enslaved increased the number of individuals owned, subsequently boosting the planter's wealth. This practice was known as slave breeding, and it is far more disturbing than it sounds. In the book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by Harriet Jacobs in 1861, an incident is described that shows how cruel fate was to these enslaved people. When my babe was born, they said it was premature. It weighed only 4 pounds, but God let it live. I heard the doctor say I could not survive till morning. I had often prayed for death, but now I did not want to die unless my child could die too. Many weeks passed before I was able to leave my bed. I was a mere wreck of my former self. For a year, there was scarcely a day when I was free from chills and fever. My babe also was sickly. His little limbs were often racked with pain. Dr. Flint continued his visits to look after my health, and he did not fail to remind me that my child was an addition to his stock of slaves. Enslavers made sure to have more healthy and strong babies born into slavery through forced reproduction. There was even a law from 1962 in Virginia called partus sequitur ventrum, which meant that a child followed the mother's status. If the mom was free, her kids were free too. But if the mom was enslaved, her kids became enslaved too. As a result, enslaved men and women were pushed to have more children to increase the enslaved workforce, especially after 1808 when the international slave trade was banned. Since enslavers couldn't bring in people from West Africa anymore, they focused on the internal market and what they called natural growth. They also controlled the exercise and diet of their children to manage their growth, raising them as workers and commodities to be sold in the market. Slavery was extremely harsh for many black slaves, especially those who worked in the fields. Slaves endured beatings, whippings, castrations, branding, piercings, amputations of limbs, and various forms of lethal violence. However, it was a slave woman in particular who often faced sexual abuse from white masters, their sons, and overseers. What's even more troubling is that many slave families were torn apart when members were sold. In many cases, the most fertile enslaved women and men were deliberately paired to have more children, even against their will. To ensure the ease of buying and selling slaves, most slaves were not allowed to marry unless their owners permitted it, and many marriages were only officially recognized after slavery came to an end. Even after the rebellion, the conditions of the slaves didn't lift at all. If anything, they only worsened. After the rebellion, there were expectations for freed slaves to leave the southern states, and free blacks were no longer allowed to own slaves. However, many free blacks who owned slaves did so to keep their own families together. In most cases, these slaves were relatives of the free black individuals. As with any rule of law, there were exceptions. Some black individuals owned slaves and treated them similarly to how white slaveholders treated their own slaves. A stark reality was that most slave owners harbored hatred toward free blacks because they contradicted the institution of slavery in the slave territory. Free blacks posed a challenge as they served as living proof that a life beyond enslavement was possible. Their freedom became an unsettling influence on the enslaved, making them desire the same freedom. Yet this freedom for free blacks was precarious and could be easily taken away. In the eyes of a slave society, the value of a free or freed black life was minimal. Unlike the compensation offered for the death of a slave based on the circumstances, the life of a free or freed black held no worth in society still bound by slavery. Although most blacks despised slavery, a class division emerged on many plantations between field hands and house servants. Many house servants believed they were superior to the field hands, often receiving better treatment, and some were the offspring of the plantation owners or their family members. Despite the strong desire for freedom among the majority of slaves, a few became informants for their masters, gaining special favors. Children were sometimes used as spies, reporting on conversations in the slave quarters to the mistress. These children were rewarded with candy and treats when they disclosed information about their fellow enslaved. However, when the betrayed slaves discovered who had revealed their secrets, those informants were isolated. In many cases, adult enslaved individuals refrained from speaking openly around children, knowing how they were manipulated by their oppressors. It is important to highlight this manipulation, as it instilled a sense of insecurity in the minds of black slaves. They couldn't trust their friends, neighbors, and worst of all, even their children. Imagine how disturbing it is to not feel safe even in your own house. The fear of being spied on, the fear of getting caught and punished for a simple act of putting forth your own opinion. Even the cost of their freedom was more than their lives. If any slave was caught fleeing, they had to suffer drastic punishment, including severe whipping, branding, jailing, and even amputation. However, death was usually the most severe punishment, although to some slaves, the selling off of their children was more severe than even that. If you did not work hard enough in the field or did not pay the proper respect to a white man or woman, you could be whipped or punished in another way. The wickedness of the slave owners was usually inflicted upon female slaves more compared to male slaves. Disturbingly, there are accounts of white owners or overseers visiting slave cabins to engage in relationships with slave women, leading the husbands to leave. If the men or women dared to voice their complaints, they faced the risk of punishment or even death. During slavery, women endured various forms of sexual abuse from slaveholders, and unfortunately, the rape of enslaved women was not considered a crime in any slaveholding state. This abuse took different forms, at times involving physical violence, while in other instances, men used coercive tactics to initiate sexual relationships. These tactics included promising material benefits or threatening to sell women if they did not submit. During this time, the typical enslaved woman had her first child at 19 years old and continued to give birth approximately every 2.5 years. This reproductive cycle, often encouraged by the master, had certain benefits for the mother. While pregnant, she could generally expect more food and fewer working hours. Additionally, her proven fertility increased her value to the owner, making it less likely for her to be separated from friends and family through sale. However, the challenges, both physical and psychological, that came with childbearing were immense for enslaved women. Expected to prioritize the needs of the master and his family over her own children, a slave mother on a large plantation would return to the fields shortly after giving birth, leaving her child to be raised by others. On a smaller farm, the responsibilities of motherhood were simply added to her existing duties. Driven by love for their children, many slave mothers chose to remain in bondage while male counterparts often attempted to escape. These stories, as disturbing and troubling as they are, serve as a reminder of the sacrifice these people made for a better tomorrow, and why we are still years away from living in a world where there is no discrimination. We have come a long way. It is not easy to change the world, but it is not impossible either. And these stories are a testament to that. We'll be back with another video. Until then, let's work towards a better future.